I would like to begin by thanking Professor Artur Boelderl and the Musils-Gesellschaft for so generously organizing this occasion and inviting me to join in the conversations that we are sharing today. I would also like to add that I have uploaded a handout where you will find many of the longer passages that I cite in my talk. When only a part of a passage is cited, the cited portion is marked in bold. On several occasions, Robert-Musil uses the expression occasionnel to characterize a range of linguistic expressions which could ultimately encompass all that will have ever been said. In a letter to Franz Blei on the proofs of Blei's Erzählung eines Lebens, Musil recommends that his friend place the word ratioid in quotation marks, claiming that this word from his essay Skizze der Erkenntnis des Dichters is, I quote handout 1, so hässlich und so occasionell, dass es eigentlich nicht Anspruch erheben dürfte, generell gebraucht zu werden und außerhalb des Zusammenhangs seiner Entstehung. End quote. With this, it is not only said that the expression ratioid is no concept that could be extracted from its context, for it is also said that the determination of this occasional expression proceeds not from a subjective origo, but from a nexus of emergence, Entstehungszusammenhang, whose scope Musil leaves indefinite here. And still more importantly, it is also thereby said that the very word which Musil says in his essay to encompass alles wissenschaftlich systematisierbare, namely ratioid, is itself occasional, with the implication that there would be an occasion for the non-occasional, and that the former phenomenon would encompass the latter rather than the other way around. But this letter to Blei is far from the only occasion where Musil would describe occasional expressions according to a nexus of indefinite scope, which would in turn encompass even supposedly non-occasional notions. In his essay from 1918 on Franz Blei, Musil will call Geist a Gelegenheitswort as well, which he cites as the provisional, variable, and expressly insufficient designation for all relations, feelings, and thoughts that would structurally escape verification as well as falsification, and that thus differ instead in terms of the predicates living or dead, lebendig oder tot. And when Musil addresses poetic expression in his Randbemerkungen an Literat und Literatur from 1931, he will also call poetic thought, I quote, occasionell wie eine Gebärde, within the context of further remarks upon the singular and occasional determination of sense. What Musil's various words upon the occasionality of expression could have meant for the thought of language is by no means self-evident, however, not least because they also imply that their sense could likewise only be approximated through analyses of singular texts, contexts, and occasions. One might begin to approach something like the meaning that occasion comes to assume in Musil then by turning to the contexts of its emergence. As scholars such as Hartmut Sellbrot have recognized, Musil's various remarks upon occasional meaning trace back, in part, to Edmund Husserl's Logische Untersuchungen, where the meaning of occasional expressions was said to change, I quote, von Fall zu Fall und wieder von Person zu Person, and examples would include I, here, and now. In their person and context dependence, Husserl insists that they essentially differ from objective expressions, which let themselves be understood according to Husserl, I quote, ohne dass es notwendig des Hinblickes auf die sich äußernde Person und auf die Umstände ihrer Äußerung bedürfte, end quote. Already in his reading notes on the Logische Untersuchungen from around 1905, this distinction appears to have been of primary concern for Musil, who tests it through an analysis of the exemplary proposition that you find on handout 2, der Friede ist gesichert. This proposition includes none of the pronomial or adverbial indices that would point to its speaker, but as Musil's analysis shows, its every term turns out nonetheless to be determined through what Husserl had called the Umstände seiner Äußerung. Since, as Musil observes, the meaning of sichern differs according to whether one is speaking of securing an account balance, or in this case, a state of peace. It is evident that, handout 2, die feste Bedeutung von Sichern sich erst in einer urteilsmäßigen Verbindung herstellt, wonach das logische Prädikat in unserem Beispiel wäre in Friedensweise gesichert. End quote. But the meaning of Frieden is also no more secure than that of sichern. Der Satz, writes Musils soon thereafter, handout 3, kann der allgemeinen Konstatierung friedlicher Zeitläufe Ausdruck geben, kann sich aber auch auf den Abschluss eines erst entstehenden Friedens beziehen. Hence, Musil concludes, der Satz ist occasionell. End quote. Whereas Husserl had found through his phenomenological investigations of ordinary language usage a foundation for logic consisting in what he calls identisch einheitlichen Bedeutungen, Musil thus finds through his investigations of the same phenomena that, I quote handout 4, das Charakteristische der Logik in meinem Sinne wäre, dass sie zwar nicht mit festen Werten operiert, aber die Tendenz auf solche hat, das heißt, so tut, als ob, end quote. To be sure, this hypothetical conclusion could itself appear to be phenomenological, derived as it is from the evidence of exemplary observations. It may even seem to affirm ideal universal meanings, whether it be a question of the substantive Wert or the modality signified with als ob, whose unequivocal general sense would not be diminished by the fact that Musil's proposition is presented in the irrealis. This semblance is complicated, however, by the fact that Musil's last phrase, namely, so tut als ob, echoes the passage from Theodor Lips's translation of Hume's Treatise of Human Nature, which Husserl cites twice in the polemical chapters on Hume from the Logische Untersuchungen that Musil had criticized in his reading notes several pages before. In the specific context of Musil's notes, that is, his tentative remark on the fictive character of universal values may itself be a citation whose meaning is not general, but rather inseparable from the specific terms of Husserl's debate with Hume. This debate had centered upon Hume's claim that universals are formed upon the basis of observed resemblances among individual phenomena, allowing us to apply, and I quote Husserl, quoting Hume, das bloße Einzelbild, das wir erleben, über seine eigene Natur hinaus, als ob es allgemein wäre, end quote. What is at stake, in other words, is precisely the status of universal notions whose meaning would, according to Husserl, have to be independent of individual occasions of resemblance. First, Husserl argues that Hume's premise that universals derive from the recognition of resemblances would lead to an infinite regress, since the formation of abstracta upon the basis of similarities would presuppose an abstract notion of similarity, which would have to have been formed from the recognition of prior similarities, and so on. Aside from this logical problem, however, the conclusion that Husserl claims would follow from Hume's hypothesis, namely the conclusion that abstract universals are, I quote, bloße Fiktionen cum fundamento in re, end quote, would entail ignoring the evident phenomenon of abstract intentional objects as such. For once the intentional structure of abstract notions is considered, Husserl argues, they appear to be independent from any intuition of individuals that may accompany them or hover in the background, just as signative understanding appears with evidence to be independent from intuitive fulfillment. In reprising Hume's als ob formulation in his reading notes, Musil marks a departure from Husserl's claims, even as his phrasing also underscores the intentional character of abstractions when he writes of a Tendenz auf solche festen Werte. The entire passage thus draws together variations upon the terminology of both Husserl and Hume, forging a nexus which implies that Hume's thought may be tenable, despite the evidence that Husserl cites to the contrary, which comes down to Husserl's observation that, I quote, individuelle Anschauungen in den Gehalt des allgemeinen Gedankens gar nicht eintreten, end quote. Against this claim, Musil notes first that we could grasp, and I quote from handout 5, nur Ähnlichkeiten, aber namenlos und unbewusst. Und so wie sie uns bewusst werden, nennen wir sie mit allgemeinen Namen. End quote. And Musil goes on to cite evidence for this possibility in what he calls, also handout 5, unser häufiges Schwanken in einer Namengebung, which would signify a wavering in the direction of intentionality itself. Such an unconscious fundament for abstraction would avoid the infinite regress that Husserl had found to follow from Hume's arguments, while our wavering in naming would suggest that each universal name would in fact be a fictio cum fundamento in re, as Musil reiterates in his Skizze der Erkenntnis des Dichters, perhaps in echoes of Husserl's formulation for Hume's position. Although Musil does not confirm Hume's genetic account of the real ground for abstract notions, which he also could not do without undermining the rigor of his analysis, since the unconscious process that Musil evokes would lie below the threshold of consciousness, Musil's citation of our frequent oscillation in naming suggests that our names and notions register other tendencies at work, not only before, but also within the conscious act of naming and meaning abstracta, rendering the meaning of each abstract name singularly multiple and circumstantial, and each supposed ideale zeitlose Einheit, that's Husserl's word, a mere semblance of one. What is critical to Musil's arguments is, once again, the occasionality of meaning, from the singular similarities that may affect each universal name to the determinations of meaning according to contextual circumstances, as well as the citational character of Musil's very notes on logical notions or fictions. But it is only insofar as Musil's remarks indicate the semblance character of objective meaning itself and expose linguistic intentionality to rest upon insecure and uncertain grounds, that his invocations of occasional meaning differ fundamentally from those of Husserl, whose efforts at terminological fixation were largely themselves a response to what he acknowledges as the Schwanken der Wortbedeutungen. These semblances and uncertain grounds are registered already when Musil speaks to the wavering that often affects our very intention to name, but they are perhaps most pronounced when Musil returns to the question of meaning and sense in his essay on Literat und Literatur, itself a text that is developed from, among others, earlier notes on Form und Inhalt, where Musil had deployed an expressly phenomenological vocabulary to examine linguistic and aesthetic differences which persist across expressions that, I quote from Form und Inhalt, intentional auf den gleichen Gegenstand beziehen, end quote. In both his published text on Literat und Literatur and in his notes on Form und Inhalt, Musil exemplifies the occasionality of poetic language by comparing the opening verses of Goethe's late poem Sankt Nepomuks Vorabend with alternative formulations which would appear to convey the same meaning in even the same meter. You find these on handout 6. Amidst these similar formulations should emerge the irreducible singularity of Goethe's lines, I quote, Lichtlein schwimmen auf dem Strome, Kinder singen auf der Brücken, end quote. What would make Goethe's poetic utterance unique and occasional then is not the fact that his poem was inspired by the processions in honor of Saint Nepomuk that Goethe had witnessed in Karlsbad. Of such details, which would situate the occasion of Goethe's poem within an objective historical order, Musil remains silent, adopting instead the phenomenological technique of imaginative variation that Husserl had introduced in his third investigation on parts and wholes in order to signal the singularity of poetic sense, which he will later explicitly describe as being, I quote, in so hohem Maße occasionell wie eine Gebärde, end quote. The word occasional thus refers not to expressions whose meaning is empirically individuated according to what Husserl spoke of as der sich äußernden Person und den Umständen der Äußerung, but rather occasional refers here to expressions whose meaning would be individuated through their sheer difference to those other meanings and expressions that seem to lend themselves to general use, including the so-called occasional ones. Having diverged further from Husserl than he had even done in his early notes on the occasionality of expressions such as der Friede ist gesichert, Musil thus suggests now that the singularity of poetic expressions can be addressed only via negativa in following what he calls their deviation or Abweichung from der gewöhnlichen Art der Vorstellungsverbindung. And you find this in handout 7. This minimal definition of the poetic itself is the most secure, das sicherste, Musil writes, although it soon appears that the constitution of habitual concatenations of notions is itself no secure given, but one which Musil first constructs for this occasion with variants upon Goethe's lines that he formulates. Musil's need to construct the habitual formulations from which Goethe's verses deviate thus renders the former themselves fictive and uncertain. Still more importantly, however, a closer examination of Musil's writing likewise shows the poetic Abweichung that he approximates in this way to be none that could be posited with certitude either. Not even after Musil's contrasting variants indicate that no general categories of meaning or form could account for the differences of Goethe's lines from their semantic and metrical equivalents. To begin, Musil's remarks suggest that the Abweichung, which distinguishes Goethe's verses, could not reside in what he here calls a selbstständige Qualität, in an oxymoronic variation upon Husserl's and Karl Stumpf's vocabularies, according to whom abstract qualities such as colors, shapes, or even forms, like perhaps trochaic meter, would be essentially unselbstständig. What emerges would therefore seem to be closer to what Christian von Ehrenfels had called a Gestaltqualität, when he sought to describe those temporal and spatial figures of motion and disposition which were thought to form of their own accord for the observer from out of certain tonal and visual data. Thus, Silvia Bonacci, among others, has elucidated Musil's thought of poetic sense along the lines of its Gestaltcharakter, whose analysis in terms of habitual formulae or traditional forms can succeed solely, as Bonacci puts it, bis auf einen Rest, auf jene unbestimmbare Qualität, die den ästhetischen Wert ausmacht. But with the gestures towards this unbestimmbare Qualität that Musil traces in his commentary on Goethe, it is not only implied that Goethe's verses form an irreducibly singular Gestaltqualität that would exceed any phenomenal correlate to those constituting acts which would bring their meaning, rhythm, and other nameable qualities to appearance. For it is also suggested that any such Gestaltqualität would appear solely through its withdrawal from such intentional acts of objectivation, and thus too through what could perhaps be called a withdrawal from phenomenality within the phenomenon of expression itself. Neither Musil nor Ehrenfels draws this consequence explicitly, but it would be in accord with Ehrenfels's emphatic description of Gestaltqualitäten as singular and therefore essentially elusive events, see handout 8, that Musil approaches the unique quality of Goethe's verses not by offering a description of them, but by describing a singular hypothetical experience of comparing Goethe's lines to a fictive Vorzustand that they never will have had before Musil's act of imaginative variation. Musil speaks namely of the event of reading, handout 9, die als Beispiel gebrauchten zwei Zeilen in ihrem Vorzustand und danach in ihrem fertigen, end quote. And it is solely this fictive experience or experiment that allows Musil to go on to assert, handout 9, dass die Einheit und Form, die sich da wie mit einem Schlag an der Stelle des diffusen Vorzustands hervorwölbt, nicht so sehr ein sinnliches Erlebnis sind, wie eine der Logik entzogene Veränderung des Sinns. Since, however, these same remarks indicate that the verbatim citation of Goethe's verses would not necessarily make its Gestaltqualität evident, but must be supplemented by a construction of variants, which Musil now casts as a genetic precedent, or Vorzustand, leading up to what he also calls the, I quote, Augenblick der richtigen Wortstellung, end quote. It is also clear that even Musil's account of poetic Gestalt here, not as an object, but as an occurrence, presents itself as a fictio cum fundamento in re. This is perhaps the most critical implication of Musil's passages on Goethe. It is not only Musil's proximity to contemporary thinkers of Gestalt, but the fictive and narrative character of his exposition, which testifies most rigorously to the insecure tendencies of objective meaning and subjective intentionality alike when it comes to the singular occasion of meaning and poetic Gestalt. For if the singular meaning and shape of poetic expression should take place as an event, and in particular as a Veränderung des Sinns or as an Abweichung from the gewöhnlichen Art der Vorstellungsverbindung, then this occasion could never be confirmed to take place once and for all, since the habitual nexus from which the poetic expression deviates would itself need to be restated or invented upon each occasion, and since any determination of its deviation would also necessarily miss the occasion, either by reducing it to an ideal object of thought, such as a selbstständige Qualität, or by reducing it to a fiction of irreducible experience, such as Musil's commentary. If such singular deviations or alterations ever take place, as Musil indicates with his performance, if not his statements, then they would have to differ according to the context of each recitation, and they would have to elude the recitation of their occurrence, with the further consequence that the singular, occasional character of any poetic formation would both resemble and differ from itself from occasion to occasion, and its apparent identity would be singularly multiple, not unlike the formations deriving from those Ähnlichkeiten below the threshold of consciousness, to which Musil had not only tentatively traced with Hume our allgemeinen Namen, but also what he calls unser häufiges Schwanken in einer Namengebung. More emphatically than in his reading notes on Husserl, however, the performance that Musil delivers in Literat und Literatur suggests that those terms and phrases which may otherwise appear to be self-identical formulations, such as Lichtlein schwimmen auf dem Strome, could only ever give semblances of themselves upon each iteration, which is also to say that their singular sense or Gestaltqualität could neither be abstracted for general use, nor established according to any one context, but would instead emerge differently each time through their differentiation from general usage and before all else through their withdrawal from objectivation, each time yielding what one could call, in a slight modification of Musil's phrasing, eine andere der Logik entzogene Veränderung des Sinns. Something like this may have been what Musil had also meant when he wrote of the constitutive citationality of literature earlier in his essay. I quote handout 10, Die schöne Literatur hat keine Ordnung außer einer historischen und vereinzelten Bruchstücken einer kritisch-ästhetischen. Man könnte sagen, dass ihre geistige Natur aus Erinnerungen ohne begrifflich fassbaren Zusammenhang besteht, und für ein solches Gebiet ist das Zitieren, die Berufung auf das runde Wort der Meister statt der herausgelösten Bedeutung, konstitutiv. End quote. For the constitutive citationality of literary writing would entail that those memories or Erinnerungen which Musil here says to compose literary history as well as its spiritual nature would be inscribed into the very formal and lexical elements of writing, with the consequence that the lexical and formal elements of literary writing would signify not as common names or abstract forms, but as iterable singularities whose context of evocation would be no conceptual order, including the chronological one. They are ohne begrifflich fassbaren Zusammenhang, Musil writes, and whose sense would similarly withdraw from conception, insofar as each citation would mark an explicit or implicit reference not to general objects and states of affairs, but to singular texts and instances of speech, whether or not any act of commemoration is even intended. Musil's explicit citation and discussion of Goethe exemplifies several of these traits, but the implications of what Musil calls the constitutive citationality of literature become perhaps most pronounced as Musil's remarks on the singular Gestaltqualität of poetic speech do not cease to be singular and citational, even when seemingly more general formulations follow upon his commentary on Goethe. Musil's subsequent remarks on singular Gestaltqualitäten resonate with Goethe's verses in ways which give another turn to Goethe's phrases and in turn permit those phrases to affect the sense of Musil's prose. Das Gefüge einer Seite guter Prose, Musil writes, I quote handout 11, ist logisch analysiert nichts Starres, sondern das Schwingen einer Brücke, das sich ändert, je weiter der Schritt gelangt. End quote. In their sheer proximity to Musil's citation from Goethe, these words on a wavering bridge echo that citation, bringing the very word for bridge or Brücke to oscillate between evoking an image for the mobile ground of prose and recalling the setting of Goethe's poem. This is what citational poetic memory may also look like, as the word Brücke bridges the poetic text of Goethe and the essayistic prose of Musil, whether it was intended to do so or not, and whether or not any other subject constitutes this memory, as if Goethe's poetic word had become a metaphor to bear Musil's more prosaic thought, or as if Musil's prosaic claim regarding prose were a further variation upon Goethe's lines. And it is because and not despite of the fact that these as-ifs could not be confirmed, that they expose the logical and poetic sense of both formulations to be semblances of one another, and thus too of themselves, or virtual tendencies which draw in different directions and thereby suspend any inclination in favor of either. At the same time, Musil's word schwingen similarly presents itself in this context not only as a signifier for oscillation, but also as an oscillating signifier, which literally condenses, verdichtet, the two verbs that were cited shortly before from Goethe's Gedicht, namely schwimmen and singen, whose resonance would in turn suggest that the oscillation in question wavers between a liquidation of sense on the one hand, one could speak of Verschwimmung, as well as its utmost formation into song on the other, Gesang, while suspending once again any dominant tendency towards either extreme. But just as the underlying tremor of which Musil speaks would neither undermine the support of the bridge nor inhibit the progress of each step upon it, a metaphor which literalizes the prosus of prosa. The very occurrence of these poetic echoes and repercussions from within Musil's prosaic remarks on good prose cannot themselves be assured, even as their suggested possibility alone would render each word more and other than the identifiable unit of meaning that it also is, more and other than a word penned by Musil, and it would thus permit another Veränderung des Sinns to take place through this permutation of Goethe's verses without prescribing, describing, or ensuring it. Unlike the genetic fiction that Musil had constructed before around Goethe's verses, the difference between occasional and objective meanings, between poetic gestures and propositional claims, becomes radically undecidable here, and it is precisely in this utterly fragile and inconclusive way that something like occasionality will have come to show itself otherwise than as a characteristic which could be confirmed and would thereby be reduced. Only where no occasion could be determined or constated definitively, that is to say, could one have happened to occur, leaving a singular trace to be retraced, recited, remembered, or otherwise approximated once again. And only because no such occasion could be constated definitively could each instance of speech also mark an occasion, with the implication that there would be an occasion for the non-occasional, and that the former phenomenon would encompass the latter rather than the other way around. But what may have taken place through the passages cited above could still be mistaken for characterizing literary formulations more than others, if it were not for the further fact that similar oscillations in meaning and expression may be registered when Musil describes the formation of iterable formulae as well. In the passages from Literat und Literatur that most extensively address the formation of habits and concepts, which would themselves be habits, according to Hume, or customs, as he most often puts it. Their occasionality is already suggested by the way in which Musil places emphasis upon the economy that underlies these geistig-ökonomischen Vorkehrungen. Conception is here assigned a practical and therefore contingent significance, which may recall the thought of Ernst Mach, but which also evokes the medicinal psychology of Ernst Kretschmer, whom Musil explicitly cites elsewhere in his essay, and who had insisted that mental objects and motor skills alike arise through the production of formulae, whose fixation spares what Kretschmer calls psychomotorische Energie. But unlike Kretschmer and before him Mach, Musil also does not offer a theory of practical economy. Something more and other takes place as he unfolds an exemplary narrative of habit formation, whose traits are drawn from the multiple valences of the words for formation and habit themselves, Bildung and Gewöhnung, that is to say, from the signifiers for certain ideal unities of meaning, which here signify the conditions of conceptuality and ideality themselves. Musil begins, namely, by drawing a comparison between the anesthetization that the habitual word root canal effects when it comes to undergoing a certain procedure of penetrating flesh and tearing out a nerve, and the process of growing accustomed to a new image on the wall. The comparison is drawn on handout 12. Genau das Gleiche vollzieht sich, wenn man ein neues Bild an die Wand hängt. Es wird einige Tage lang in die Augen fallen, dann aber schluckt es die Wand ein und man bemerkt es nicht länger, obwohl sich wahrscheinlich der Gesamteindruck der Wand ein wenig geändert haben wird. Durch das Wort Gewöhnung, mit dem man sich zu begnügen pflegt, wird so etwas nicht hinreichend bezeichnet, denn dieses Wort drückt nicht die tätige Bedeutung des Vorgangs aus, die offenbar darin besteht, dass man immer in seinen vier Wänden wohnt, bei stabilem Ganzem mit ungeteilter Kraft das tun zu können, was gerade die besondere Aufgabe ausmacht. Das ist sogar ein Vorgang, den man sich wahrscheinlich bis aufs Größte ausgedehnt denken darf, denn die sonderbare Illusion, die man Geschlossenheit des Lebensgefühls nennt, macht wohl auch den Eindruck, eine solche geschlossene geistige Schutzfläche zu sein. Habit is illustrated here, in other words, by tracing the diminishing appearance of an illustration on a wall. Musil characterizes this formative process as assimilation. The wall swallows the image whole, and as the formation of a perceptual unity through assimilation. This process is not entirely unlike the formation of conceptual unities from out of similarities that Hume had spoken of before, but with the crucial difference that here, neither qualitative similarity nor even unconscious acts of grasping similarity are presupposed. Instead, unity, in this case of the wall, is forged by a reduction of sensible difference, literally anesthetization, and in yet another way than he had done in his critique of Husserl's critique of Hume, Musil thus avoids the infinite regress that would follow if abstract notions were thought to be formed through the comparison of similar individuals, requiring an abstract notion of similarity, and so on. Should one exercise imaginative variation and reformulate the change that Musil describes in more phenomenological terms, it could be said that the same sensory data lends itself to different apprehensions as the seemingly static wall appears to absorb the new image that had initially appeared prominent. But if intentionality would make the difference, then it would have to be a passive intentionality, which is not an act of the cogito, and even then it would be one that aims not to see, not to intend, and it would do so for reasons that are also not universal, but particular, contingent, or occasional, if you will, for the sake of what Musil here calls die besondere Aufgabe. There could therefore be no rule or legality to determine the conditions for this procedure, even if we should think it to be aufs größte ausgedehnt, as Musil recommends. Nor could it be seen to occur by the very subjects who perform or undergo it, so long as it is working, with the consequence that habitual formations of this kind, including presumably concept formations, would be radically circumstantial and fundamentally unknown. What cannot be said through such a variation upon Musil's exemplary passage, however, is the way in which the coincidence of Musil's words for the vanishing image, or Bild, and the resulting habit formation, or Bildung, makes the self-effacing, as well as other effacing, character of habit formation pronounced. That is to say, Bildung is shown to efface the Bild as well as itself, and aesthetic synthesis to work as an anesthetic, as the singular wording of Musil's prose discloses the apparatic structure that is implicit in these metaphors of everyday vocabulary and psychological terminology, an apparatic structure which itself appears literally here as one meets with a wall. And it is similarly in turning the decorative figures of everyday speech into a drama of objects that Musil displays the tätige Bedeutung des Vorgangs called Gewöhnung, in a way that the word does not habitually indicate, but that it does come to exhibit here. At the same time, however, the fact that Musil's quasi-poetic exposition is carried out not only through, but also upon the vocabulary for formation and habituation, exposes the sense of these operative concepts to a certain wavering or oscillation by drawing out the ways in which they will have always been themselves figures of speech, similes, and instances of Verdichtung, which is precisely why they can lend themselves in the first place to the more unusual repetition of their likeness that Musil offers. The meaning of formation and habit, in other words, is shown to have been fundamentally insecure, as these and similar words are cited and varied in Musil's exemplary fiction, which therefore may be said to go further than even Hume had done in suggesting that common names and abstract notions would be fictions cum fundamento in re. This is not to say that Musil denies that these words, like any others, may also be understood in the more straightforward manner that makes up the ideality of meaning according to Husserl, for whom all wavering in meaning comes down to a wavering in the active meaning, which his attempts to fixed terminology should secure against. In allowing this possibility, however, Musil also does not guarantee it. Instead, he exposes its precarity, and he also allows more, as his writing on habit formation, among others, permits the terms that he recites to say more and other things than they more often appear to mean. What is permitted to take place upon the occasion of Musil's written performance is the semblance of divergent meanings in the place of each term, including the formative terms for habits and concepts themselves. Thus, what Musil says in his essay of poetic usage holds true for his prose as well. I quote from handout 13. An der Stelle der begrifflichen Identität im gewöhnlichen Gebrauch tritt im Dichterischen gewissermaßen die Ähnlichkeit des Worts mit sich selbst. End quote. Nor could the character of semblance that marks poetic usage be exclusive to the words of poetry, since Musil's logical arguments and rhetorical performance alike imply that singular contextual circumstances allow even words with seemingly fixed objective meanings to give occasion for other senses and signifiers to suggest themselves. As Musil will reiterate in the paragraph that I have been quoting just now, also handout 13. Wenn man eine Bedeutung erfasst, guckt die andere darunter hervor, whereby this very claim may likewise exemplify the movement it describes, offering a variant upon Musil's words for the semblance of words, that itself resembles, remembers, or recites other words in turn, such as the exemplary narrative that Hume had offered when he sought to illustrate the relation between similar individuals and abstract names. Thus should we mention the word triangle, Hume wrote, and form the idea of a particular equilateral one to correspond to it, the other individuals of Escalinum and Isosceles which we overlooked at first, immediately crowd in upon us." End quote. The structure of language and logic that Musil exposes thus entails that each word could mark a singular occasion for deviant tendencies and divergent instances of speech to emerge and withdraw themselves. And since there could be no telling in advance what the terms and limits of such Entstehungszusammenhänge may have been, there would also be no term, passage, or topos that could not be the place or bear the trace of such occasions. Each word could, in other words, mark a utopic occasion for singular deviations and immemorial memories to occur, each time in a manner that withdraws from objectivation and confirmation, and therefore, too, in such a way where no single expression eigentlich den Anspruch erheben dürfte,